Welcome to this recording from the Various Urban Politics Seminar Series. In the following, you hear Josh Ryan Collins from UCL London talking about the financialisation of housing, drivers, outcomes and options for reform. It will be followed by a response by Dirk Bezemer, University of Groningen, the Netherlands, and a discussion. The recording is of 13th November 2024 and recorded at the University College Groningen. Two further talks from the same afternoon by Elisabetta Gobbo and Sarah Özegül and myself, Christian Lamker, are available separately.
Okay, welcome everybody to this afternoon's seminar. Really thrilled that you all come. This is the second seminar in a series, We're Urban Politics, which we are organising with the University of Groningen, organising together with the Faculty of Spatial Sciences, Christian Lamker in particular, who you'll meet later. And we've also organised this afternoon in coordination with the PPE Centre represented by Dirk Bezemer. Very nice to be able to work all together. Today's topic is politicizing or repoliticizing housing. As we all know, be here, in many parts of the world, housing has sort of re-emerged in the last years as a political hot topic due to several factors: financialisation of the housing sector. House prices have risen sharply due to insufficient supply, perhaps, and other factors. And of course, in some cases, in the Dutch city, for instance, the supply of social housing has also been decreased. So this has made affordable urban housing out of reach for many residents, city residents, and of course leads to the need to re-examine this issue anew. So our first speaker this afternoon is Josh Ryan Collins, who's joined us here from UCL, University College in London, where he is Professor of Economics and Finance at the Institution for Innovation and Public Purpose. And he convenes a political economy module, Rethinking Capitalism, which sounds very interesting, at this institute. Serves as Senior Policy Fellow in the UK Development of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, advising on housing affordability, and is also a member of the Progressive Economy Forum think tank, amongst other things. So really wonderful to have you here. Thanks for joining us. And to respond to Josh, we've got Dirk Bezemer, who's Professor of Economics of International Finance Development at the Faculty of Economics and Business here, and also a board member of the PPE Centre. And so that will take us the first hour, then we have a small break. And then we are going to hear from Elisabetta Gobbo, who is a PhD student at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. She is working on political philosophy at the urban level, focusing on gentrification and housing, amongst other things. And really looking forward to hearing her talk. And then finally, we have Christian Lamker and Sarah Özegül, who are both working here at the Faculty of Spatial Sciences. And they will talk to us about urban planning and justice in relation to property development. And then we have time for a final discussion, and that can be continued. Come in, welcome. With drinks at the end. So we would really warmly welcome you all to stay for that discussion. And also just to say the next lecture has been planned for January. We've got a scholar visiting us from Cape Town, South Africa, and she'll talk about urban citizenship. But we'll put more details of that on the website in due course. Thank you all for joining us, and now we'll switch over to Josh.
Thank you. Great. Thanks so much, Marian, for the introduction and for hosting me. Thanks for everyone for turning up today. So I'm going to talk about the financialisation of housing. Much of the debate in high-income economies, including in Europe, is focused on the supply of housing. So we're not building enough homes to meet the demand from people. However, much less attention has been given to really analysing in depth the nature of the demand itself for housing. And that's what I'm going to kind of kick off with, really. I am doing some work for the UK government on this topic, so my talk will reflect a little bit on some recent data that are there. So there are two main forms of demand for housing. There is demand for housing as a consumption good, provides us with services, enables us to have shelter, most obviously, enables us hopefully to live somewhere where we can bring up our children, where we can reasonably easily get to work. So that's the, I think a lot of policy and economics, to be honest, and housing policy kind of makes an assumption that this is the main form of demand, certainly policy anyway. But there is, of course, another major source of demand for housing, which is investment demand, the demand for housing as a financial asset in which to store wealth over time and to generate returns over time, and also as a source of collateral. This is extremely important in more Anglo-Saxon economies like the US and the UK, where we have quite liberalised rules around home equity withdrawal. I know in the Netherlands there's slightly less liberalised home equity withdrawal rules. Nevertheless, there is still a role for housing as a financial asset here, I think. With regard to the demand for housing as a consumption good, what's very important to understand about housing is it has a high income elasticity of demand. So I don't think there's too many economists in the room, so I'll explain what that means basically. It essentially means that your demand for it actually increases the wealthier you get. So if you imagine, you have 10 pairs of trainers or 15 pairs of trainers, the demand for one more pair of trainers is not going to be very high. Probably reach satiation point essentially with these kinds of commodities. That's not actually the case. The studies show anyway, that's not the case with domestic space or sort of demand for better location. So, people always want to live in a slightly better place, whether it's nearer to a good school for your kids or in a nicer environment or nearer the train station so you can get to work faster, or a bigger place. So you have that bit more space, you can work at home more comfortably, bigger garden, whatever it may be. So some research in the UK that shows a 10% increase in incomes leads to 20% more spending on domestic space. What this means, of course, is as income inequality increases, one can expect the access to housing to also increase, the inequality of access to domestic space. Because basically rich people will consume more and more and more, leaving less for everyone else. But the main focus of my talk is going to be on this second aspect of demand, the investment demand for housing. And this is a function of four main dynamics: the availability of credit, so whether the mortgage market is liberalised, whether banks will make loans, mortgage loans, the cost of those loans, the cost of capital, where interest rates are, the running costs associated with owning a home as an asset or as a financial asset. They may have different levels of tax depending on the policy environment, whether it's your second home or it's your primary residence. And it's also very important to do with the expectations of future returns. Will house prices go up in the future? If everyone thinks they will, it's pretty likely more people will invest in them. So, and that's been a very important driver of house prices over the last 40 years or so. Now, if we actually look in this chart at the return on housing, the return can be defined as the increase in the value of the home, the capital gains, and the rental yields, if it's a second home, an additional property, has actually averaged around 7% in high income economies over the last 150 years. This is some recent research by some US economists. Now, what's interesting about that is it's roughly the same as the return on equity, so the return on holding stocks or shares, which is usually seen as a sort of alternative type of asset, important asset for holding wealth. So roughly the same on average, but as you can see from that chart, much less volatile. It's a much less volatile investment than owning stocks and shares, much less variability over time. So this phrase, safe as houses actually has some real genuine empirical evidence backing it up. It has been a very good investment over time. Now, it's very important to understand that the main driver of increasing house prices is not the fact that the cost of the bricks and mortar or the infrastructure around housing has got more expensive. It's the fact that the land underneath the home has gone up in value. This is the really important thing to understand. So if you want to understand housing and affordability, you've got to actually understand land markets. You've got to understand how they work. Now, one can increase the supply of land to a certain extent. And the main way of doing that is by building infrastructure, particularly transport infrastructure, to essentially bring land that is essentially not economically accessible into the orbit of the places where jobs are, basically. So extending railway lines, most obvious example. And we saw a big expansion in transport infrastructure in high-income economies in the post-war period. And there's been some studies which show that this actually helped prevent rapid house price increases. But from the kind of but there's only so far you can take that, right? You can't. There are limits to that, and I think Netherlands is probably a good example of a country which you have a high density of population, and there's only so much more kind of transport infrastructure that you can put down without running into real ecological limits as well as spatial limits. So in that sense, land is inherently limited in supply, and the housing supply, because of that, is relatively inelastic. Of course, it varies, but overall, you're not looking at a commodity that can just be easily increased if demand increases, unlike most other commodities, unlike mobile phones, unlike most commodities that economists think about. And there's a research that shows that around 80% of the house price increases since since 1950 in high-income economies are explained via increases in land values. Now, very important to understand that landowners are actually able to absorb this increase in value that is created by the investment in infrastructure in the areas where land is situated, via the fact that they own homes, they own the land. And this sort of capture of value is viewed by economists as a form of economic rent. And economic rent is was seen as an enormous problem, actually by the founders of economics, by Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, the classical economists, who viewed this sort of capture of the economic surplus by when they were writing mainly agrarian landlords as the greatest threat to capitalist progress, actually. And they wrote at length on why this was a problem. And this is a nice quote from Adam Smith illustrating this problem and recognition that the landlord essentially enjoys this increase in value, despite the fact they have contributed nothing to that increase. That it's the community that's created that value, whether it's the private sector or the public sector. Building a new railway station is a really good example of, you get this sudden uplift in land values due to that decision, due to that public investment in many cases. And in fact, the European Commission has recently publicly recognised this problem as well in this rather good report from 2022. Measures to reduce the ability of homeowners to extract this rent could be part of a durable solution to the house price inflation and housing crisis. Unfortunately, in the intervening period between when the classicals were writing and now, economists just completely dropped the ball on this rent problem. It was seen as not really a serious issue, that in the long run, rent returns to housing would reach some equilibrium state, and it was sort of obfuscated, essentially. in this very vague concept of capital, which I won't go into the history of that right now, but it's a messy history. Anyway, so my work has focused very much on this problem of land rent and the qualities of land, and what happens when that bumps into a highly deregulated, liberalized financial system. Okay, so I've already talked about how land is highly inelastic in its supply. Everybody wants to live in the desirable locations. Land is also obviously fixed, spatially fixed. It's not mobile, you can't move it around. And it tends to appreciate in value over time, as I've already talked about. So it has these three very important qualities. Those qualities make it enormously attractive to financiers, for banks, investors, as a form of collateral. In fact, it's the most desirable form of collateral, with a possible exception of government debt issued by currency issuing nations. And the reason for that is it has all the opposite properties of credit or money. Credit and money is highly elastic. Basically, banks can create money at will, as hopefully most of you will understand. They expand their balance sheets when they make a loan. They don't borrow. They don't take money from elsewhere. And so lending by banks, credit creation, is determined by their confidence and regulation around capital requirements and liquidity requirements. Dirk's done a lot of work on this as well as myself. We've also seen finances increasingly mobile, globally mobile. It can move around the world very, very quickly. And it normally will depreciate in value because of inflation, unless it is invested in something that also appreciates in value. And that is why housing and land and real estate more generally is so attractive to the financial system. So that's kind of at the center of my argument, understanding these opposite qualities. Now, what we've seen in most high-income economies, there's a few exceptions, but even they, I think, are gradually moving in this direction, is where you have a very liberalized financial system, where you free up the ability of banks to make loans against existing assets, real estate, in particular residential real estate, even more important than commercial real estate. You get this positive feedback cycle between the relatively inelastic supply or fixed supply of land and housing, and this more and more credit, more and more loans. Most mortgage loans, you have to remember, don't finance the building of new buildings. They finance the competition between people to purchase the existing buildings. Right? So all you're doing by liberalizing mortgage finance is throwing more money at an mainly existing stock of housing. The inevitable result of that is house price inflation. Nobody really disagrees with that point. But what we've fallen into is this kind of positive feedback cycle where you liberalize the financial sector, mainly in the 1980s and 1990s. You liberalized the banking system. That led to rising house prices. That led to increasing demand for housing, home ownership in particular, because it suddenly became clear that owning a house was by far the best way to build your wealth over time. Right? Also because you didn't pay any tax, certainly on your primary residence, in contrast to owning stocks and shares, where you would pay tax on dividends and capital gains if you sell the asset. So you get this kind of positive feedback cycle, more demand. Banks are prepared to make more loans because the collateral that is backing the loans has also gone up in value, because the collateral is the house or the land underneath the house itself. There was a sort of tipping point, I guess, in the 80s and 90s, where a majority of the population began to own their homes. They wanted to see house prices continue to go up. Their expectations they would continue to go up, and they started putting pressure on governments to make sure that the value would keep going up by ensuring, for example, that proposals to increase taxes were not gone through with. We saw the privatization of public housing, the liberalization of development policy. What was really going on here was increasing capture of these land rents by homeowners. And the macroeconomic regime also became aligned with this kind of residential-based capitalism, residential capitalism, as it's been called by some political economists, where you have very low interest rates, which drives up mortgage lending, drives up both the demand and the supply of mortgage lending. And you have, as I said, a tax system that favours the capture of these land rents. And you actually have a political alignment increasingly between the interests of home-owning middle and upper middle classes, the financial system that's making the loans, and the real estate sector that is actually, although they're not building that much, they are making increased profits because the price of the land underneath the stock that they own and sell is going up. So they're increasing their profits. Now, Australia is probably the kind of ideal type example of this, even worse than the Netherlands and the UK, I would say. And I wrote a paper together with Cameron Murray, going through exactly how this process happened in Australia, and I've kind of done similarly for the UK. And what governments did in response to this emergence of this feedback cycle was the opposite of what they should have done. Instead of repressing this demand for housing as an investment good and this demand for housing as a financial asset, they subsidized it. They gave people, especially lower income people, subsidies, first-time buyer loans of various types, equity loans, so that they didn't need such a massive deposit to buy their home. Even subsidies on second homes. I know in the Netherlands you still have a discount. You can offset your taxes against interest on second homes that you own if you're a landlord. We had that in the UK. It was basically phased out by 2008, I think. Nevertheless, the result of this is that you're just pumping even more money in to this limited supply of housing stock. And we've seen in the UK this homeowner subsidy just inflating house prices, and thus not making any difference actually to affordability. The other area that I'll talk about is the role of institutional investment. So how pension funds, insurance companies have also got into this, but I'll come on to that. This chart, which is based on data, a very good database by Maurice Schuler and Alan Taylor, shows you house prices and credit stocks averaged across 14 high-income economies. The credit stocks on the left-hand axis, house prices, the dotted line on the right-hand axis. And what you can see here is this sudden shift in the late 1990s of a sudden sort of split between non-mortgage credit, which is mainly loans to firms, and mortgage credit, this sudden sort of separation. So when they were both around 40% of GDP, these outstanding loans in the late 90s, and you get this sudden shooting up of mortgage credit matched by the increase in house prices during this phase of mortgage market deregulation and innovation. And macroeconomically, this is bad news. Dirk and many others have done research showing that actually more mortgage credit to GDP, when mortgage credit rises faster than income, it's likely to result in increased financial crises and more severe recessions and crises than other forms of credit bubbles, and also that basically contributes negatively actually to GDP growth after a certain point. So macroeconomically, this kind of policy doesn't actually make sense. This chart has completely gone mad. I don't know how that happened. Anyway, what this chart should show you is that actually in the home-owning democracies, just ignore the chart, in the home owning democracies, the Anglo-Saxon economies of Australia, US, Canada, UK, Netherlands, New Zealand, we've had this sort of synchronization in declining levels of home ownership since the 2000s. So in the economies where they're most obsessed with everyone owning a home, whereas this is seen as a right of every citizen, and all policy is aligned towards trying to help everyone own a home with these huge subsidies for first-time buyers, we've seen declining home ownership from around sort of, on average, probably 75 or 70% down to sort of low 60s today. So it's a sort of remarkable outcome in that sense. So what I've just talked about really is kind of housing financialisation 1.0, the first version. The second part of the story with financialisation is sort of what happened since the global financial crisis. Because the global financial crisis was a crisis of excessive house price. It was caused by a massive house price bubble, and it was caused by the way in which the financial system packaged up those loans and spread them through the entire global financial system via residential mortgage-backed securities purchased by pension funds and other institutional investors via complex derivatives and the rest. And so there was quite a strong pushback against excessive mortgage lending after the GFC. And after the GFC, we've seen actually bank lending in the UK, in the Netherlands, in most countries, really flattening out and even declining, but at least the increase in the growth rate of bank lending relative to incomes and GDP. But the other thing that happened was central banks were very worried about the low growth that followed the recession and the low growth that followed the crisis. Their response was, let's bring down interest rates to stimulate growth. So they reduced interest rates down to the zero lower bound, and they engaged in these enormous programs of quantitative easing, which involved buying up basically the safest assets in the market, typically mainly government bonds, also some corporate bonds. The idea behind that was, if we do this, if we essentially replace these safe assets in investors' balance sheets with money, newly created money, they will use that money to invest in the real economy. They will buy shares or they will do real economy investment, and this will stimulate growth. That basically didn't happen. What happened was investors either sat on the money or they invested it in existing assets, including, yes, you've guessed it, real estate. They pumped money in particular into the global cities, Amsterdam, Tokyo, New York, London, Vancouver, San Francisco, until you saw this, again, interesting synchronization story. You can see here on the left-hand side of these major cities essentially synchronizing, house prices synchronizing away from their hinterlands, right, away from the smaller cities and towns in the same country as they became globally attractive safe deposit boxes, basically. So housing in these cities, real estate in these cities became sort of akin to gold as a sort of safe asset, an alternative to government bonds, but with a higher return because of the quantitative easing, which had really repressed the value of previously the safest asset. And the other part of the story, of course, was the way in which the financial sector kind of innovated to take advantage of the conditions that followed the financial crisis, aided by policy. We saw the EU essentially saving the residential mortgage-backed securities market, no doubt under pressure from the financial sector, and propping it up, keeping it going. And then in the US especially, you saw some very aggressive buying up of property, which had fallen enormously in value. So these sort of fire sale dynamics, as people were thrown out of their homes because they couldn't afford to pay the rents because they or pay the mortgages because they lost their jobs because of the financial crisis, and bought up en masse by companies like Blackstone And you had the emergence of real estate investment trusts, which I know are very active in the Netherlands, but various other forms of real estate related funds. And what these firms were doing was they were basically filling the rent gaps in these cities. They were buying a property maybe that was less, not particularly in the best of state. Then they would invest some money in it to build it up, sort of build to buy to rent, and they would ramp up the rents. And you saw many people being forced out of of areas where they previously lived. So the state kind of again did the wrong thing. Generally, they gave very generous tax breaks to institutional real estate investors. They carried on privatizing public housing programs under the austerity that we had after the GFC, further deregulated rental markets, but carried on paying out decent subsidies for renters, which obviously again helped the landlords get the returns on investment. And there's a very nice report by Daniela Gabor and Sebastian Kohl on this process and the quite complicated financial structures that we use to essentially cipher institutional capital into these build-to-rent sort of models. That chart on the right just shows you the massive increase in the corporate buy-to-let investment in Europe between 2007 and 2020. This story, all of this happened in the Netherlands. This chart shows you the decline in mortgage credit, the growth of mortgage credit since 2012, actually. But house prices did fall quite a bit, but then really picked up again since that period. I think this must have a lot to do with basically a shift really from debt-driven investment to what you might call wealth-driven investment. And there's a nice paper by Cody Hossenbach and Manuel Albers arguing the case for this. And you can see there this enormous growth in the share of buy-to-let purchases in the Netherlands of all major cities by individuals and firms growing over time, quite spectacular increases there. So both institutional investment by firms and individual smaller landlords increasing their owning of homes as first-time buyers were sort of priced out. So you now have a situation where you have higher interest rates, of course, but it doesn't help first-time buyers because they can't afford the deposit, and you have increasingly, I think, cash buyers coming in and some wealth-driven investment. So for this report I did for the government, I did a sort of very crude analysis, I guess, of kind of two attempts by the UK government to try and break some aspect of this kind of housing finance feedback cycle. Not very powerful attempts, but attempts nonetheless, I suppose. So in 2016, the Conservative government they doubled the rate of tax on the purchase of second homes, basically. So it's called the Higher Rates on Additional Dwellings, HRAD. And then, of course, in 2021, we had this massive interest rate shock, much higher interest rates. So in the UK, we have data on the buy-to-let market and on transactions that were either second home transactions versus overall transactions. You have both those data sets. So this chart shows you what happened to the buy-to-let market. You can't see the year very well, unfortunately, there. But there was this big fall after the GFC. But then post GFC, it really picks up, and actually the sort of flattening on the sort of fifth bar from the left did coincide with the 2016 introduction of the higher rate of tax. So maybe some evidence that's happening. But then if you look at this chart, which shows you total transactions buying homes in the blue chart and all liable higher rate of tax transactions, you can see there's less evidence of these two frictions in the cycle having much impact. And you can actually see second home purchases as a percentage of total has actually grown, despite the higher rate of tax being introduced in 2016. There was an initial fall off in higher rate transactions, but it doesn't seem to have made much difference. And the percentage of transactions involving mortgages, buy-to-let mortgages, has actually fallen. So the fact that the total transactions the fact that total second home transactions has not, suggests that it's cash buyers who are basically coming in and buying up these properties. That essentially there's a underlying demand for housing as a financial asset from pretty wealthy people who are not actually that sensitive to higher rates or higher taxes. So you need to do more. You need to do more to kind of break the cycle, is the conclusion. And this chart shows you this big rise in cash buyers, the yellow line, since 2013, and sort of stagnation of the other categories. So what's the alternative? What's the alternative here? As I said at the beginning, the most common argument is we just need to build more homes, and that will solve the problem. Actually, the evidence for that is quite weak. The evidence in the UK is if you increase the households per capita by 1%, you get like a 1 or 2% increase, a fall in house prices. If you think that house prices in the UK have increased by about 300% on average over the last sort of 20 years, you realise that's not going to make a big dent. Only around 1% of transactions for homes are new builds in the UK. So you've got to start thinking more about the existing stock. How do we do more with the existing stock? And the other major reason to do that is for environmental reasons. So we did a study, myself together with some environmental and material scientists. We looked at the previous Conservative government's housing strategy, both its plan to build 300,000 new homes every year for 5 years, which is exactly the same as the Labour Party's plan, by the way, and their plans, relatively limited and unambitious plans on retrofitting what is basically the most poorly insulated stock in Europe, in the UK. And we actually found that looking at both these embodied and operational emissions, the government's business as usual housing strategy would consume 114% of the UK's carbon emission budget to 2050, aligned with our Paris Agreement of limiting temperatures to below 2 degrees. Essentially leaving no emissions for any other sectors at all. So every other sector would have to sort of immediately decarbonise fully if we were to continue with our housing strategy. So that was a kind of interesting bit of research. We did some different scenarios, looking at a more ambitious kind of green supply side scenario where it's the same rate of new build but to higher standards and much more ambitious retrofitting of the existing stock. We still ended up with it would absorb 70% of the emissions budget. The only solution that's kind of more realistic in terms of allowing other sectors to also decarbonise was this much more ambitious retrofit strategy where you actually really limit the new builds, and you just have a much more you make better use of the existing stock in terms of the distribution of space. Still absorbs 60% of the emissions budget. One of the reasons the construction sector, maybe some of you know, is so difficult to decarbonise is because concrete is basically incredibly difficult to decarbonise compared to, for example, the energy sector, where you just shift from one sort of energy to another, and the infrastructure generally involved with new housing is incredibly environmentally damaging. So, partially because of that paper, which we published in 2022, I became much more interested in the distribution of the existing stock. Can we do more with the existing stock? And actually, one of my PhD students has been working exactly on this topic, and he's been mapping the distribution of housing. And in the UK, we have a bedrooms standard. I know in Europe, I don't think you have this, but you have a sort of bedroom standard, and you have a government definition of both overcrowding, where there's not enough space for the people living there, and under occupation, which is defined as having 2 or more spare bedrooms. And so we use these definitions. My colleague, my PhD student, used these definitions, he came up with this analysis of the UK, sort of how close the UK is to what one might call an efficient or sufficient use of the housing stock. And what we found is that the amount of under occupation, where people have 2 or more spare bedrooms, the orange bar there, is actually almost 20% of households, in comparison to a much lower level for empty homes, and a much lower level of overcrowded housing. And mainly this is outright owners, and it's mainly retired couples, basically. These are essentially people who bought houses in the 70s, 60s, 70s, when they were cheap, and had families left, and they haven't downsized. Part of the reason they haven't downsized, of course, is the enormous value of housing as a financial asset, pass on the wealth to your kids. And so they stick around, basically, in those homes. And the argument here is, if you just manage to get a small percentage of those baby boomers to downsize, not all of them, which of course is totally unrealistic and politically impossible, but just a small percentage, because actually geographically these are actually more of these in the cities. They're not all kind of off in the countryside somewhere. There actually is more of this under occupation in the cities. In fact, he found that if you looked at the under occupation level households in London, if you got rid of all of those, you could completely reduce overcrowding in the whole of the rest of the country. Obviously, it's unrealistic because not everyone wants to live in London. But anyway, the point being that these are quite evenly distributed. You could potentially have a huge impact on housing affordability. So that was kind of where my research has been going most recently. For the study I did for the government, I looked at 3 broad policy interventions. Probably going over time a bit, am I?
Mildly, yeah, but in that 5 minutes.
I'll run through this quickly. Yeah. First type of intervention: financial regulation, financial policy interventions. For example, you could just increase the loan to value or loan to income ratios to sort of repress mortgage credit, dampen the housing finance cycle, make it less volatile. Could, in theory, be introduced by an independent central bank, which is concerned about this financial instability, this boom-bust cycle that we seem to be stuck in. So those are the sort of advantages. The disadvantages is this is likely to hurt first-time buyers more than anyone else. So it's not from a social justice perspective, it doesn't work unless you sort of say home ownership is not important, which is kind of, I think, unrealistic in most European economies. It doesn't really deal with the problem of land rent extraction or existing land rent extraction, and may even further concentrate those rents in existing homeowners. And it may not make much difference to these institutional capital flows that I've talked about. And there's a question of whether central banks would be persuaded to intervene in a way that would really could lead to political concerns that they were going beyond their mandate. I think there's much more potentially to be said for. Sorry, just before I get to the land value capture, I think there's much more to be said for restricting loans in the buy-to-let market, the second homes, which, as we've seen, is a much purer form of rent extraction or purer form of investment you easily identify this is somebody buying a house as a financial asset. But it's also actually much more, it leads to much higher levels of financial instability. Such loans tend to be correlated with booms and busts. So stronger motivation for central banks there. Land value capture policies, I think, are a really good way. Using the planning regime to capture these rents, it has a lot going for it. Politically, maybe less challenging. There are a number of mechanisms for doing this: zoning, land leasing, community infrastructure, levies. So I think this is something that's definitely worth exploring. Bit of a question about the macroeconomic impact, perhaps less significant. For me, probably the most important policy that we need to be getting into is increasing property taxes, or having a much more serious property tax or a land value tax. That's for me the best way of capturing these land rents in a comprehensive fashion and really repressing this investment demand, because you would basically get to the heart of the problem of you're essentially saying you're not going to be allowed to capture those land rents if you had, say, an annual land value tax on the percentage value of a property. And I've argued in the UK that we should get rid of transaction taxes, actually, and get rid of council tax, which hasn't been revalued since '91, and just replace it with an annual tax on the value of the property. This is all politically very, very challenging, of course. From the environmental perspective, the argument would be all new homes should really be net zero and affordable, and we should be limiting the ability to convert properties to tenures that are less efficient or less efficiently used or less affordable. So as you've done in Amsterdam, clamping right down on short-term lets, Airbnb, preventing people converting their homes away from long-term rents to short-term lets, but also perhaps giving local authorities the ability to buy homes coming onto the market and convert them to public housing. So rather than just relying on just building more and more and more affordable housing, let's start converting some of the existing stock to affordable housing, much more environmentally sustainable, as well as just being easier and much, much cheaper. So giving local authorities right of first refusal, and then massive investment in retrofit. Barcelona is a really good example of a city that's actually doing this. Last slide. At scale. So they are developing lots of new homes, and there's a nice picture of one there that I took when I was in Barcelona 2 years ago. Extremely environmentally well-insulated homes. But they're also purchasing, they've pushed through this right of first refusal for the municipality, and they're buying en masse homes that are being sold onto the market and converting them to affordable. So that's it. Summary: land and housing have different and unique economic properties. If you deregulate the land market, it will tend towards monopoly. If you deregulate the financial sector, it will put that on speed. Essentially, banks will inevitably lean towards real estate investment. So we've got to do a lot more market shaping of both these sectors. Thank you.
Thank you for that absolutely fascinating and rich talk. Dirk is now going to take a few minutes to respond.
Yep.
Then we'll have a few minutes for questions before we're having a break.
Bear with me, I'm trying to bring something up here. Okay. So Josh, thank you very much for this very information-rich, information-dense presentation. I've seen and heard around me the scribbling of many notes, and so many questions will be asked, no doubt. So Also, you've, as we say in Dutch, a homeowner's expression, I suppose, you've mown some of the grounds before my feet. But that's only good because we'll need our time. I'm bringing this up to show you some of the research I've been doing recently. I'm of course not going to take you through it. I encourage you to read it. But the title is how I try to encapsulate the problem in thinking about housing, roof or real estate. And the problem is that our government and most of the public discourse considers housing as a roof, and we need to consider it as real estate to understand what to do about it. And I want to, in response to Josh's remarks, I want to maybe briefly go through the counter arguments, and you will stop me if I should stop, right? So please do. Counter arguments which I've encountered in the public debate in the Netherlands on this. I've been doing, as Josh mentioned, for many years research on mortgage markets, and in recent years, I wrote a book about the Dutch economy. I engaged in professional public publications. I gave witness in the Tweede Kamer Parliament, and I engaged with other economists to write a report that we offered to the cabinet, the previous cabinet, of course, not the present one, on what to do about the housing market. And so let me share my experience of inserting arguments like Josh's arguments applied to the Dutch housing market. This paper is a model calibrated to the Dutch housing market. What are the conceptions or the misconceptions that beset the debate? Because I think it's, as in so many areas, it's not difficult to think of technical solutions. We can, for instance, increase the tax on the value of housing. I think that's by far the most effective way of decreasing house prices that really don't add anything to housing affordability. But what are the barriers to doing that? Obviously, there's a political barrier. This will harm the asset-owning class. That's obvious. We can talk about that more. But there's also conceptual barriers. And the first conceptual barrier, let me take you through an extremely short economic toy model. Economists like toy models. If a child walks into a sweet shop with money and buys sweets, an economist might ask, what is the cause of the child buying the sweets, or the price of the sweets, right? Are you with me? It's an extremely silly question, but that's what economists do. In effect, Josh is saying, and I'm saying in my research, it's the money that the kid brings into the store. The money drives up the price. Now, all economists will say that's really nonsense, Bezemer. That's nonsense. The money that is paid for transactions, maybe it's the proximate cause, the immediate cause of what happens, but we of course need to use ultimate causes, right? We need to look deeper. And the real causes of the prices of sweets and of housing are the income of the kid. How much is her pocket money? The borrowing. If you don't have the income, can you borrow money to buy sweets? So preferences. What are your preferences for sweets or for floor space? So income, preferences, interest rates, those are the things that drive housing prices, not money flows. Now, actually, I would advocate the silly position of saying, well, actually, money flowing into housing markets can push up housing prices, causing an affordability crisis. And money flows into the housing market here. I'm leaving the sweets now. Money into the housing markets come in different forms. Mortgages, which is money created, as they say, out of nothing. Money created by banks, which goes into the mortgage markets. Savings, and so Weber-Boomi savings is a big pool of money, which is now trickling or sloshing into housing markets, or international investment money. There's a lot of international investors in London and Amsterdam, and that's driving up prices. The conceptual barrier for economists who dominate this debate, and even people who are not, card-carrying economists, have been exposed to economics in their university studies or have embraced the economics way thinking in their engagement with economists. The economist way of thinking is money flows cannot be the ultimate cause of house prices. And so we cannot really think about policies that stop the money flows, because that's not addressing the real cause. There was a very interesting survey done, and I read about this in a paper on share prices, a survey done among financial economists, done at the top academic conference, and these financial economists were academics, often with side jobs in the financial sector, people who knew practically and theoretically what was going on in the share markets. And the survey question was, if there is an inflow of $10 into the share market, will that push up share prices? Now, economists being economists, whether they think about housing, assets, or shares, stocks, assets, they're all assets. And the economists' theory about what the price of an asset is, it's the net present value of the future income that you get from the asset. You with me? So the price of a share should be the profit of the firm that issued the share from now into the future, capitalized into one value now, the net present value. Money flows don't come into this formula. There's a formula for net present value, okay? Money flows don't come into this formula. So if a pension fund, let's say, decides to invest more in this share market, that shouldn't move the price, certainly not in the long term. So among, I think it was a few hundred professional economists who gave an answer to this question, do money inflows increase the share price? The median answer, so the most representative answer, the median answer was 0. The effect on the share price should be 0. And then the authors of this paper, they did empirical research, they have a theoretical model behind it, show that the effect is clearly positive. Inflows into the stock market push up stock prices. As Josh mentioned repeatedly, inflows into a fixed stock of existing housing push up house prices. If we don't get this insight or this fact across, which is obvious to people who haven't been exposed to economics training, but which is a taboo almost to people who have been exposed to economics training, if we don't get this across, we are still to start the whole debate. That's the first misconception. I have 2 minutes for my other misconceptions. The second misconception is that capital gains, which is the increase in the value of assets, so the house price increases, they're only temporary things. Prices of assets, share prices, house prices, they go up and down. We know there are financial crises and busts. They go up and down. So there is no permanent long-term increase in house price or whatever beyond economic growth. They always have to adjust, come back to the level of economic growth. Empirically, this is not the case. But in economic models, that's impossible. It has to be the case. We can talk longer about why it has to be the case. I'm just giving the counter arguments to the financialization story, which says these financial factors, capital gains and inflows, cannot really be the fundamental factors. And so we do not need to address them. Instead, we have to address the fundamental factors, which is on the demand side. It's preferences and income. Now, we're not going to touch that, is what your average economist will say, because preferences are sacred. They are autonomous. We're not going to, we're not centrally planned economists. We're not going to force people to do what they don't want to do. And incomes are also beyond our control. So that's the demand side for housing. We're not touching that. On the supply side, where we do have real factors, such as expanding the housing stock, and financial factors, such as limiting the inflow of investor money and mortgage money into the housing markets, well, we're not looking at the financial factors. We're only looking at the real factors. And so just as in the UK, they want to build 300,000 houses for many years. In this country, they have the plan to build 1 million houses in the next 10 years, which is completely pie in the sky. But apart from the practical difficulties of that, the carbon budget and other difficulties, the question is, will it really help? Are you not building new speculative objects? And it will attract more money, and it will not reduce house prices. So what I'm saying is that the housing affordability crisis is maybe, what we're saying in this paper, is the housing affordability crisis is maybe not a problem of physical shortages of too few housing units, bricks and mortar. If you look at the data, the average housing per household hasn't declined much over the last 8 years, in which the affordability crisis has developed since 2015. But maybe it's a problem of too much money inflow. That's the financialisation story, and that is a hard sell for the reasons that I mentioned. Thank you very much.
Yes. My suggestion now, is we're running a little bit behind time, is that we take, say, 10 minutes max now to give you a chance to respond, Josh, and then to take a couple of questions from the audience, and then we'll take a shorter break for coffee and tea, just 10 minutes, and then we'll start our next session just 5 minutes later, and I hope to catch that up in the course of that next session. Anybody have any major objections? Speak now. Please. Great. Okay.
I don't have masses of.
Okay.
I mean, I agree with everything Dirk said, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure I've got a major response. I mean, I've had the same sorts of dynamics in the UK.
Yeah.
So why don't we just open it up?
Yes. Then I'll say, please, who's got a question? Yes. Sander, then Bart, and then another one. Yes.
Thank you very much both for your presentations. I'm very interested. You ended there with talking about supply side and demand side interventions. When we talk about supply side interventions, it's quite often about numbers. Building 300,000 houses, building 1 million houses. What about qualitative supply side? Right? Beyond thinking only what we produce, how do we deal with building public housing, public rental, home ownership? To what extent can you do market interventions? Let's say, we're going to build 20,000 houses a year, through public rental housing. What would the impacts be there, and what kind of counter-arguments?
And surely that retrofitting that you talk about is part of that quantitative flipping or changing the supply. Yes.
Yeah. No, I have no objection to that argument, as long as you're still thinking about the existing stock, for the reasons I explained, for environmental reasons. But I think it is the case. Actually, what I think we need most in the UK anyway is we need new stock for those retired couples who need to basically, live in smaller places with the appropriate facilities, to help them, live comfortably. And actually, I think there is a stock issue there, that we don't have enough. And unfortunately, because we've sort of outsourced the building of housing to the private sector, the private sector has a preference to build big houses because they get scale economies from that and higher returns, rather than smaller houses for couples. So our stock's not very well distributed in that sense. But yeah, the argument would be any new housing should be basically affordable or meeting that, enabling downsizing to free up the existing stock.
Next question.
Yeah, Josh, you showed a wonderful graph in the Netherlands, I think, by Manuel Albers and Cody Ostenbach.
Yeah.
To illustrate that we have two phases of financialization, one with credit availability as engine, and the second phase with vital landlordism as engine. And I'm wondering, in the Netherlands, since the time period this graph ends, somewhere in 2020, a lot of regulatory changes have taken place under quite a neoliberal conservative government, which is actually amazing that they didn't attempt to re-regulate some of the housing market. Re-regulation of rents. We have seen a drop of vital landlordism. Interest rates have gone up. Well, they're not really related, but still. So, do we see a third phase of financialization now? Because actually, house prices have kept rising, or is there something else going on? So, what does this case tell us about financialization?
Yeah, the short answer is I don't really know for the Netherlands, because I'm a bit surprised that house prices have kept going up because they came down in the UK. They've been coming down since the interest rate shock over the last 3 years. They started going up again recently, so that seems to have ended. But I guess in the Netherlands, there must be more of this wealth-driven investment. You know, I mean, yeah, in the UK, I think there's an inflection point when prices go low enough, you suddenly get this rush of wealthy investors.
Do you think Brexit played a role in the UK? Sort of.
So Brexit was 2016, so it didn't. We had rising house prices right up to kind of 2021. So I'm not sure how important Brexit was.
But not sort of direct Brexit, but sort of secondary effects of Brexit.
So Brexit hasn't reduced immigration. It's actually, we've had more immigrants since Brexit. If that's what you mean. But
direct investment flows, foreign investment.
Yeah, my impression is it hasn't made a huge difference to financial flows coming in.
There was a question on this side. I think you had a question, and then yours. Yeah.
I have a lot of questions, but I choose one. And it's about the repoliticizing housing. And I think the framing of what's the problem. We talk about land, materials, and labor to construct houses, the production factors. But the land market, I think it's really about rights. It's not so because if you have a piece of land and you don't have a right to build on it, it's by worthless. It's the right to dwell. It's a tradable, imperative right to dwell that you can sell to another one. And if you have a like house and you get split it into two houses that are visible independently, some of it is much more than just a house, even if you don't have to add anything to the house. So I think when you talk about the problem of how land and housing, maybe it would be in a political economy more susceptible to talk about the rights to housing and the right to dwell, and also in the land market you see the right to construct, because the people, builders, and they buy the land to have a monopoly to construct. If you are the owner of the land, then you're the only one that is able to build there. And we see it. So land market is a rights market for construction or for dwelling.
Yeah.
And shouldn't we talk about land, materials, labor, and rights?
Yeah, so when I was talking about land value capture, that's really what I was getting at. So who has the right to capture these land rents? It's certainly not clear that it should just be whoever's richest, and so who can outcompete everyone else to buy a parcel of land. So that's why local municipalities have a key role. The planning system is, in effect, a bulwark against excessive rent extraction by whoever is either strongest or richest, basically. So sort of in the UK, there's this, planning is seen as holding back development and creating the housing crisis by reducing supply. And so there's an interesting counter movement, quite a sort of campaign really against this idea, and actually saying, look, planning is actually how we think about the fair distribution of those ownership rights in a way that's sustainable and can create sort of more socially just outcomes.
And this is a nice link to the presentation in the afternoon, so I hope we'll return to this topic and be able to discuss it in more detail. I'm going to move on to last two questions, your question and then here on the yellow jersey. Yes.
Thanks so much. So I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer. And I've the one very short question. What I understand is that the household size is decreasing in Ireland. So there are newer households with less people. And that influences like housing demand a lot. So I didn't hear you talk about that. Maybe you can say something about that. Second one, that's my legal perspective. I agree with Baan, right? The last 4 years, there has been like a huge intervention from government. So we brought 90% of the housing stock in the Netherlands, or rental housing stock, under rent control.
And there is a ban on buy-to-let in the major municipalities. So Barend already told about that, and you replied to that. But what I found very interesting that we see a backlash from the financial institutions. So the central bank in the Netherlands, the president of the central bank, half a year after, or not really, I think 3 months after the introduction of the rent control, he already concluded it's a failure. We should stop with it. There's no evidence at all whether it's a failure or not. There are some indications that property owners are now selling their stock or their premises. But that's an interesting backlash. You see the same from, of course, like the organizations of landlords and property owners, but they also use students to campaign for that. So there are even student associations now saying, our members are losing their homes because the landlords are forced by the government to sell the properties. Can you say something about that in the light of financialization of housing, right? So that type of backlash, you see the same in your research on it?
Well, we don't have any rent controls at all in the UK, so I haven't been able to look at that empirically. But my view is rent controls, certainly in cities, are probably a good way of dealing with these financialization dynamics, because you're essentially reducing the yield. You're making housing less attractive as a financial asset. Pretty directly, yeah. Now, to your point about whether it reduces the rental stock, which is a valid question, again, that for me is a case for giving municipalities the right to have first dibs on potentially buying those properties and making them available as affordable housing, whether it's for students or people who really, maybe need houses even more than students. But obviously, much of that stock might just go to first-time buyers, which politically might be seen as a good thing. I'm not quite sure why the head of the central bank here hasn't thought about that kind of potential outcome. Maybe it's something to do with what Dirk was saying about the sort of internal models of how systems work.
One last question.
Here's your question about the second home buying. There's not much profit, because, like from your slides, 7% profit, I think, annually, and then if the taxes go up and then the maintenance costs, etc. Even if it's wealth-driven, why is the consumer behavior is continuing the way it is? Why do people keep on buying?
That's a really good question. Actually, the yields in London have really fallen dramatically as well, as I'm sure they have in Amsterdam. I think it's to do with this. Partially, it's to do with this sort of dual function of housing as a consumption asset and a financial asset. Some of these investors will want to live in the property, even the super wealthy, buying a house in a nice part of London. Actually, it might be nice to live there some part of the year. That's quite a common thing. And I think it's also to do with the nature of the asset as a long-term investment. So even if taxes and interest rates are high now, in 5 years, it might look very different. And the value of that property might be going up much more. Right. So I think a lot of these investors are not your average short-term investors. They're not, they're actually slightly longer-term investors. In London, we have students who come to UCL in taxis, and it turns out, usually from Asia, that their parents have bought them penthouse flats on the river as long-term investments. And they're basically the super rich. It's a complex story. They're not, in that sense, like pure financial assets, homes in the way other like stocks and shares are.
There are so much more to say about this, but let's take a break, get a cup of tea or cup of coffee, go to the loo if you need to. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Various Urban Politics is a hybrid seminar series hosted by the University of Groningen, the Netherlands. The series is organized by Marian Counihan, University College Groningen, and myself, Christian Lamker, from the Faculty of Spatial Sciences, with input from Elen Trell, Marlieke Wilders, and Ryan Wittingslow. We are hosted by the Transitions and Social Justice Working Group at the Rudolf Agricola School for Sustainable Development and funded by the Young Academy Groningen SER Interdisciplinary Projects Incentive Fund.